The ancient amphitheater of the Galactic Council had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the forging of peace treaties that lasted millennia, and declarations of war that reshaped star systems. But in its 10,000-year history, it had never hosted an emergency session quite like this one. 12 towering crystalline spires surrounded the central speaking platform, each one pulsing with the bioluminescent patterns of a different member species. The air itself hummed with translated languages. Melodic Zephyrian wind songs, the harmonic crystals of the Nixari, the deep subsonic rumbles of the Corvan collectives. Yet beneath the familiar symphony of galactic politics, an undercurrent of fear threaded through every communication. Ambassador Valdris of the Alterian hegemony, his 7-foot frame encased in ceremonial armor that had been forged in the heart of a dying star, stepped onto the speaking platform. His forearms spread wide in the traditional gesture of grave announcement, and the chamber fell silent save for the soft hum of universal translators. "Honored counselors," Valdris began, his voice carrying the weight of 3 billion years of Alterian civilization. "The unthinkable has occurred. Long-range sensors at the galactic rim have confirmed what our ancestors hoped never to see again." He paused, his large compound eyes scanning the assembled representatives. "The void. Swarm has returned." The reaction was immediate and visceral. The Nixari delegate's crystal form flared from deep blue to violent crimson. The Corvan sphere actually lifted from its platform, anti-gravity generators whining in distress. Even the normally stoic Zephyrians ruffled their feather-like appendages, in agitation. "Impossible," resonated the harmonic voice of crystalline singer of final notes, the Nixari representative. "The barriers have held for 10 millennia. Our ancestors sacrificed entire fleets to seal the void between galaxies. The barriers have failed," Valdris continued grimly. 3 outer rim systems have gone dark in the past standard month. No distress signals, no survivors, no trace of civilization remaining. Only the signature void space distortions that mark their passing. The Corvan sphere descended back to its platform with a deep, mournful tone that reverberated through the chamber's bones. "The ancient records speak of their hunger," the collective voice intoned. "They do not conquer. They do not enslave. They consume everything, matter, energy, information itself, and leave only emptiness behind. How long do we have?" The question came from High Commander Threk of the Valonian Star Empire, her scarred mandibles clicking with nervous energy. Based on their historical rate of consumption and current trajectory, Valdris consulted a floating data display. "The swarm will reach the core worlds within 18 standard months, perhaps less, if they encounter no meaningful resistance." "Then we must give them meaningful resistance," declared General Korthak of the Drakmarian military caste, his genetically enhanced muscles rippling beneath bioarmor that had never known defeat. "The combined might of the Council has grown considerably since our ancestors faced this threat. We are not the same species that cowered before them 10,000 years ago." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. The Galactic Council represented the military might of 11 of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. Trillions of beings lived under their protection, defended by fleets that could shatter moons and weapons that could ignite stars. "Agreed," Valdris nodded. "We must combine our forces as never before. Each member species will contribute their greatest warships and most experienced crews. The Zephyrian hegemony has already pledged their Windcaller fleet, 2,000 living ships with quantum biological weapons that can adapt to any threat." The Zephyrian delegate, a graceful being whose form seemed to shift like captured wind, gestured acknowledgement. "Our ships are already gathering at the Nexus staging ground. They hunger for battle against the void spawned." "The Corvan Collective offers our sphere dreadnoughts," rumbled the floating orb. 50 world ships each, carrying 1,000,000 warrior drones and reality-bending weapons that rewrite the laws of physics themselves. One by one, the great civilizations pledged their contributions. The Nexari promised their crystalline war forms that could phase between dimensions. The Valonians offered their planet-killer battle stations. The Drakmarians would deploy their genetically perfected super soldiers. Fleet after fleet, weapon after weapon, the combined military might of galactic civilization assembled for the greatest war in 10,000 years, until all eyes turned to the smallest spire in the chamber. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood barely 5.5 feet tall, her simple gray diplomatic uniform a stark contrast to the elaborate ceremonial garb surrounding her. At 37 years old, she was young even by human standards, let alone galactic ones. She represented the newest member of the Council. Humanity had been granted membership only 50 years prior, after their surprising tenacity in resolving a minor border dispute with Alterian colonies. Ambassador Vasquez, Valdris addressed her with the patient tone one might use with a child. Humanity's contribution to the war effort would be welcomed. Perhaps your defensive platforms could assist with evacuating civilian populations. The subtle condescension wasn't lost on anyone in the chamber. Humanity controlled exactly 73 star systems, a rounding error compared to the Alterian hegemony's 100,000 worlds, or the Corvin Collective's galaxy-spanning territory. Their technology was primitive, their population barely 10 billion, their military a collection of ships that the other species considered quaint antiques. Elena smiled, the expression somehow managing to be both diplomatic and unsettling. Thank you for the suggestion, Ambassador Valdris. However, after consulting with Earth Command, we've decided to contribute to the combat operations directly. How thoughtful, Valdris replied, though his tone suggested he found it anything but. And what ships will humanity be sending? Your entire fleet, perhaps? We're sending the Defiance, Elena replied simply. The chamber fell silent. Not the reverent silence that had greeted the great fleet pledges, but the awkward quiet that follows an unexpected confession of poverty. The Defiance? Repeated High Commander Threk, her mandibles clicking in confusion. One ship? One ship, Elena confirmed, her expression never wavering. General Korthak's enhanced physiology couldn't quite suppress what might have been a snort of amusement. Ambassador, surely you understand the scale of the threat we face. The Void Swarm destroyed 3 galaxies before our ancestors barely managed to contain them. A single ship, however well-intentioned, will be sufficient for our purposes, Elena interrupted gently. Captain Chen and her crew are already en route to the staging ground. The Nexari delegates' crystals shifted through a spectrum of colors that the translators rendered as incredulous disbelief. 200 humans in a single vessel against an enemy that devoured the predecessor empire? This is either unprecedented courage or unprecedented foolishness. Perhaps, Elena said, gathering her diplomatic materials with calm efficiency. I suppose we'll find out which. As she walked toward the chamber exit, the assembled representatives of galactic civilization watched in a mixture of bewilderment and barely concealed contempt. The humans had always been odd, but this seemed like cosmic arrogance of the highest order. None of them could have imagined that they had just witnessed the moment when the galaxy's fate was sealed, not by the greatest fleets ever assembled, but by the quiet confidence of a species that understood something the others had forgotten. Sometimes being underestimated was the greatest weapon of all. The Void Swarm was coming, and humanity was ready to remind the galaxy why David had always been more dangerous than Goliath. The Kepler Nebula had once been a nursery of stars, a vast cloud of cosmic dust and gas where new suns were born in brilliant displays of nuclear fire. Now it served as humanity's introduction to true horror. Fleet Admiral Kethavar of the Alterian Navy stood on the bridge of the Eternal Judgment, a kilometers-long dreadnought that had never known defeat in 300 years of service. Around him, holographic displays showed the largest military formation in galactic history, 11 million ships arranged in perfect battle formations that stretched across light-years of space. The Zephyrian Windcaller fleet moved like a living organism, their bioships rippling with muscle contractions that propelled them through space. The Corvin Sphere dreadnoughts hung like miniature planets, their surfaces crawling with weapon ports and warrior drone deployment bays. Nexari crystal ships phased in and out of visible spectrum, their crystalline hulls refracting starlight into weapon-focused beams. And hanging at the very back of the formation, almost an afterthought, was a single human vessel. The Defiance was, by galactic standards, laughably primitive. 500 meters of metal and ceramic composite, powered by fusion reactors that the Alterians had considered obsolete for millennia. Its weapons were kinetic projectiles and directed energy beams, technologies so basic that military academies across the galaxy used them in historical simulations. "Sir," reported his tactical officer, "the human vessel is maintaining position at the rear of the formation. They haven't responded to battle group coordination requests." Admiral Kethvar's compound eyes narrowed as he studied the tactical display. "Cowards," he muttered, though part of him wondered if the humans were simply being realistic about their chances. At least they have the wisdom to stay out of the way. The first contact with the void swarm came without warning. Space itself seemed to tear open at the nebula's edge, reality peeling back like an infected wound to reveal something that existed in the spaces between dimensions. The swarm poured through the breach like a flood of nightmares, biomechanical horrors that defied easy categorization. Some were as large as moons, others as small as fighters, but all of them shared the same hungry emptiness that made veteran warriors feel cold despite their heated armor. "All ships," Admiral Kethvar broadcast across the fleet's tactical network. "Weapons free. Show them the fury of civilized space." The opening barrage lit up the nebula like a newborn star. Quantum torpedoes that could crack planets, plasma streams hot enough to melt asteroids, reality-warping beams that deleted their targets from existence. The combined firepower of galactic civilization unleashed itself against the swarm. The results were spectacular. The leading edge of the swarm simply ceased to exist, vaporized by weapons that represented the pinnacle of 11 civilizations' military development. Cheers erupted across command channels as the first wave of void spawn dissolved into cosmic dust. Then the second wave adapted. The swarm entities that followed seemed different somehow. Their biomechanical forms shifted and flowed, surfaces becoming reflective where energy weapons struck, hulls hardening where kinetic projectiles impacted. The quantum torpedoes that had been so devastatingly effective moments before now detonated harmlessly against adaptive shielding that shouldn't have been possible to develop so quickly. "Impossible," breathed Admiral Kethvar, watching his tactical displays with growing horror. "They're learning in real time." The swarm's counterattack came in waves of living artillery that screamed through space with sounds that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the primitive fear centers of the brain. Alterian dreadnoughts, ships that had weathered the fires of 1,000 battles, cracked open like eggs as biomechanical claws that were somehow larger on the inside tore through armor that had been forged in stellar cores. A Zephyrian windcaller, its living hull pulsing with bioluminescent distress patterns, tried to use its adaptive biology to counter a swarm entity's attack. The void spawn studied the bioship's defensive measures for exactly 37 seconds, then replicated and inverted them. The windcaller's own adaptive systems turned against it, dissolving the ship from within. "All ships fall back to secondary positions," Admiral Kethvar ordered, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Implement Tactical Protocol Delta 7. But even as the fleet repositioned, the swarm was learning from their movements. Formation patterns that had been perfected over millennia became death traps as the enemy predicted and countered each maneuver. Weapons that had been the pinnacle of galactic technology became useless as the swarm developed immunities faster than new targeting solutions could be implemented. From her position aboard the Defiance, Captain Sarah Chen watched the slaughter, with the detached professionalism of a scientist observing a particularly interesting experiment. Her bridge crew, all 200 humans aboard the ship, sat at their stations with an almost eerie calm, surrounded by displays that showed data, streams the other species couldn't even perceive. "Captain," her tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander James Park, reported without looking up from his console, "the Alterian Admiral is requesting immediate tactical support. His flagship is taking heavy damage." "Continue passive scanning," Chen replied, her dark eyes never leaving the tactical hologram that showed the battle in three-dimensional detail. "Record everything. Pattern analysis, adaptive responses, command and control structures. I want to know how they think." Ma'am. Her communications officer, Lieutenant Sarah Torres, turned in her chair with obvious concern. The Nexari battle. Group just lost 6 ships. The Corvin Sphere Dreadnought Infinite Unity is reporting critical damage. Shouldn't we? We should learn, Chen interrupted gently but firmly. That's why we're here. Across the fleet's command channels, the questions were becoming demands. Why weren't the humans engaging? Where were their famous tactical innovations? Had they come all this way just to watch their allies die? Admiral Kethvar's voice crackled through the communication system, barely controlled rage bleeding through the universal translator. Human vessel Defiance, you will advance to combat. Positions immediately or be marked as cowards and deserters. Captain Chen activated her communication system with a touch. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost conversational. Admiral, with respect, we're still learning. Learning? The Admiral's reply came through gritted teeth as another explosion rocked his flagship. We're dying out here while you hide in the back like frightened children. No, sir, Chen replied, watching as her crew continued their methodical data collection, while the greatest military force in galactic history crumbled around them. We're doing our job. She closed the channel before the Admiral could respond, leaving the fleet to wonder, what job could possibly be more important than fighting for the survival of galactic civilization? In the depths of space, the swarm continued its inexorable advance, each adaptation making it stronger, each victory teaching it new ways to kill. The galaxy's defenders found themselves fighting an enemy that learned from every mistake, countered every strategy, and grew more dangerous with each passing moment. But aboard a single human ship, Captain Chen and her crew continued their quiet work, recording patterns that no one else could see, building a database of information that would soon prove more valuable than all the galaxy's weapons combined. They were still learning, and the swarm had no idea what humanity's education would ultimately cost them. 3 weeks had passed since the first engagement at the Kepler Nebula, and the galaxy was learning what true despair felt like. The Alterian 7th Fleet, once the pride of their military academy, had been reduced to scrap metal and cooling plasma in the Rigel system. The massive Corvin Sphere Dreadnought Eternal Convergence, a ship that housed 3 million warrior drones and had taken 2 centuries to construct, was now a hollow shell drifting through space, its interior consumed by biomechanical parasites that had somehow learned to replicate Corvin technology better than the Corvins themselves. In the Vega sector, an entire Nexari crystal fleet had attempted their signature phase jump maneuver, a tactical innovation that allowed them to shift between dimensions and strike from unexpected angles. The swarm had observed the technique for exactly 47 minutes, then learned to phase shift their own entities to match. The crystal's advantage had become their doom as void spawn materialized inside their hulls, tearing them apart from within. Admiral Kethvar stood in what remained of the Alterian command center aboard the heavily damaged Eternal Judgment, staring at tactical displays that told the same story across a dozen star systems. Retreat, adaptation, defeat. His fleet had been reduced to 30% of its original strength, and the survivors were showing signs of what his medical officers delicately termed combat ineffectiveness syndrome, the polite military phrase for warriors too broken by horror to fight effectively. Sir, his communications officer reported with barely concealed exhaustion, we're receiving tactical updates from the Zephyrian and Drakmarian battle groups. They're requesting immediate withdrawal to defensive positions around the core worlds. Denied, Admiral Kethvar said automatically, then paused, his compound eyes focusing on something that had been nagging at the edges of his consciousness for days. Wait. Bring up the tactical overview from all engagements. Every system. Every battle. The holographic display expanded to show the 3-dimensional progression of the war across local space. Red markers indicated swarm positions, blue showed galactic forces, and yellow tracked battle sites. It painted a picture of inexorable advance, of brilliantly executed strategies crumbling against an enemy that seemed to have an answer for everything. But there, at the edge of every engagement, was a single green marker that never moved, never advanced, never retreated. The human ship, Admiral Kethvar muttered, his mandibles clicking in frustration. 3 weeks of battles and they haven't fired a single shot. Not one. His tactical officer, Commander Veltar, displayed what might have been confusion if translated to human expressions. Perhaps their weapon systems are non-functional. Their technology is primitive. No, the Admiral said slowly, studying the pattern of the Defiance's movements. Look at their positioning. They're always at the optimal observation point for each engagement. Not hiding, observing, but observing what? Meanwhile, 300,000 kilometers from the Admiral's damaged flagship, Captain Sarah Chen sat in the Defiance's primary analysis lab, surrounded by more data than had ever been collected about a single enemy in the history of galactic warfare. Her crew had worked in rotating shifts for 21 standard days, compiling behavioral matrices, adaptation algorithms, and response patterns from every swarm engagement. The lab looked less like a military facility and more like a graduate research center, with whiteboards covered in equations, holographic models rotating slowly in the air, and the soft background hum of quantum computers processing terabytes of information every second. "Show me the core of an engagement from the Proxima system again," Chen requested, settling into her chair with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Dr. Elizabeth Reyes, the ship's xenobiologist, manipulated the holographic display to show the battle from 2 days prior. The swarm entities encountered the Corvin gravity well weapons and adapted within 14 minutes. They developed counter-rotating mass fields that not only negated the weapons but turned them into thrust enhancers. "Reaction time is decreasing," observed Commander Park, reviewing his own set of data streams. First engagement with similar weapons took them 43 minutes to adapt. Second took 27. Now we're seeing adaptation in under 15 minutes for previously encountered technologies. "That's not the interesting part," Chen said quietly, her eyes never leaving the tactical replay. "Run the scan data on the swarm entities during the adaptation phase. Focus on the quantum entanglement signatures." The display shifted to show energy patterns invisible to normal sensors. What appeared were threads of connection between individual swarm entities, not just within the immediate battle group, but stretching back across light years to other battles, other encounters, other learning opportunities. "My God," whispered Lieutenant Torres from her position at the communications console. "They're sharing information instantaneously. Every adaptation learned by one group is immediately available to all groups across the entire swarm." "It's more than that," Chen said, her voice carrying the quiet excitement of a researcher who had just solved a puzzle that had been bothering her for weeks. "They're not just sharing information, they're sharing consciousness. Look at the decision-making patterns." Dr. Reyes manipulated the display to show tactical decisions made by different swarm groups across multiple battles. The patterns were identical. Not similar, not analogous, but absolutely identical down to timing measurements. "They're not individual entities making similar decisions," Dr. Reyes breathed. "They're extensions of a single intelligence, a hive, mind operating across galactic distances through quantum entanglement. Which means," Commander Park continued the logical chain, "every battle we've fought, every tactic we've used, every weapon we've deployed, it's all been observed, analyzed, and cataloged by a single superintelligence that can deploy perfect countermeasures instantly to any point in space." Captain Chen stood, walking to the main display and placing her hand against the holographic representation of the swarm's network architecture. The quantum entanglement lines pulsed with data flow that represented the accumulated military knowledge of galactic civilization being processed and turned against its creators. "The question becomes," she said softly, "how do you fight an enemy that knows everything you're going to do before you do it?" "Captain," Lieutenant Torres interrupted, "we're receiving another message from Admiral Kethvar. He's demanding our immediate participation in combat operations. His language is becoming quite colorful." Chen smiled grimly. "Tell the Admiral that we'll be ready to engage soon. We've almost finished learning." "Learning what, ma'am?" "How to teach," Chen replied, her eyes still fixed on the swirling pattern of quantum connections that represented the swarm's greatest strength. "Because that network that makes them unbeatable, It might just be the key to defeating them. Information flows both ways in a quantum entanglement system. They've been downloading everything we know about warfare. She paused, her expression shifting to something that might have been anticipation, might have been grim determination, or might have been the satisfied look of a professor who had just figured out how to turn a final exam into a teaching moment. It's time we uploaded something in return. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened not in the ancient amphitheater on the neutral world of Concordia, but aboard the Alterian command ship Last Hope, hastily converted into a mobile headquarters as the swarm pushed inexorably toward the core worlds. The crystalline spires had been replaced by flickering holographic projectors, and the atmosphere of dignified discourse had been replaced by barely controlled panic. Admiral Kethvar looked like he had aged a century in the past month. His once pristine, ceremonial armor was scorched and dented, his compound eyes dim with exhaustion and something approaching despair. Around the improvised council chamber, the representatives of galactic civilization presented a picture of military collapse that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. The Drakmarian 4th Battle Legion has been completely destroyed, reported General Korthak, his genetically enhanced physique somehow diminished by defeat. They attempted a frontal assault on the swarm concentration in the Centauri system, using our most advanced bioweapons. The enemy adapted to the pathogens within minutes and turned them back against our own forces. The Nexari crystal fleets have withdrawn to the inner rim, added crystalline singer of final notes, her harmonic voice carrying overtones of mourning that needed no translation. Our phase shift technology, perfected over millennia, has become a liability. The enemy now anticipates our dimensional movements better than we do. One by one, the reports came in. The Zephyrian bioships were being turned against themselves, their living hulls corrupted by swarm entities that had learned to mimic and improve upon organic technology. The Corvin sphere dreadnoughts, once thought invincible, were being systematically dismantled by enemies that had decoded the mathematical principles underlying their reality-warping weapons. We are faced with an inescapable conclusion, Admiral Kethvar said, his voice heavy with the weight of 3 billion years of Alterian military tradition. The enemy learns faster than we can adapt. Every weapon we deploy becomes obsolete within hours. Every tactic we employ is countered before we can fully implement it. At our current rate of attrition, the core worlds will fall within 6 standard days. Then we evacuate, suggested the Valonian representative. Save what populations we can and retreat to the Outer Rim territories, perhaps in a few centuries. There will be no Outer Rim, interrupted a new voice from the chamber's entrance. Captain Sarah Chen walked into the room with the confident stride of someone who had spent the last month solving an impossible puzzle. Behind her came Dr. Reyes and Commander Park, their arms filled with data tablets and portable holographic projectors. The assembled representatives turned to stare at the human captain with expressions ranging from hope to incredulity to barely restrained fury. Admiral Kethavar's mandibles clicked in what his translator rendered as bitter sarcasm. "Ah, Captain Chen. How gracious of you to finally join us. Perhaps you've come to explain why your ship has remained safely in the rear while the rest of us have been dying." Chen ignored the hostility in his voice and walked to the central holographic projector. "With your permission, Admiral, I'd like to show you what we've learned." "Learned?" General Korthak's enhanced muscles rippled with suppressed rage. "While you've been learning, I've lost 3 million warriors. What could you possibly have learned that's worth?" "How to win," Chen said simply. The chamber fell silent. Chen activated her portable projector, and suddenly the room filled with a 3-dimensional representation of the swarm that was unlike anything the council members had seen before. Instead of showing individual entities, it displayed the quantum entanglement network that connected every swarm unit across light years of space, a vast web of information flowing at faster than light speeds. "This is what you've been fighting," Chen explained, manipulating the display to highlight connection nodes and data flows. "Not a fleet, not an army, but a single distributed intelligence. Every battle, every adaptation, Every tactical decision is made by one consciousness experiencing the war from millions of perspectives simultaneously. We suspected as much, Admiral Kethvar said impatiently. A hive mind. It explains their coordination, but not how to defeat them. It explains everything, Chen replied, zooming the display to show the quantum entanglement connections in detail. Look at the information architecture. Every node is both receiver and transmitter. The network requires perfect information flow to maintain coordination across galactic distances. Dr. Reyes stepped forward, her voice carrying the excitement of a researcher sharing a breakthrough. The swarm's greatest strength, its ability to instantly share adaptations across all units, requires quantum entanglement channels operating at theoretical maximum efficiency. Any disruption to the information flow would cause cascade failures throughout the network. You're suggesting we target their communications? Crystalline Singer of Final Notes crystals shifted to patterns of skeptical inquiry. Our best quantum disruption weapons barely affect their technology. No, Chen said, her expression shifting to something that might have been anticipation. We're going to overload their network with information they can't process. She manipulated the display again, showing theoretical data flows. The swarm consciousness is optimized for logical analysis and adaptation. It processes tactical information, technological principles, and strategic patterns with perfect efficiency. But there's one type of information that no purely logical system can process effectively. Commander Park activated a secondary display, showing human neural activity patterns, chaos, creativity, irrationality, the beautiful, unpredictable mess of human consciousness. You're insane, General Korthak rumbled, though his tone carried more fascination than dismissal. You want to fight a superintelligence with randomness? Not randomness, Chen corrected. Humanity. Our greatest weakness. Our tendency toward illogical decisions, emotional responses, and creative chaos might be the one thing that can break a perfectly logical enemy. Admiral Kethvar leaned forward, his compound eyes focusing intently on the human captain. Explain. Chen's smile was both grim and oddly hopeful. The swarm network operates by processing and distributing information instantaneously. But what happens when you feed a hyperlogical system information that's inherently contradictory? What happens when you upload human consciousness, with all its paradoxes, emotions, and creative irrationality, directly into a network designed for perfect logical consistency? It would be like trying to run poetry through a mathematical equation, Dr. Reyes added. The system would attempt to process concepts like love, hope, sacrifice, and artistic beauty as tactical data. It would try to quantify things that can't be quantified, analyze patterns that exist specifically to break patterns. The network would crash, Commander Park concluded, not from damage but from logical overflow. The swarm consciousness would fragment as it tried to process information that violates its fundamental operational parameters. The council chamber was silent for long moments as the implications sank in. Finally, Admiral Kethvar spoke, his voice carefully controlled. How do you propose to upload human consciousness into their network? Chen's expression became deadly serious. The defiance will penetrate to the swarm's central node. My crew will interface directly with the enemy network and broadcast our thoughts, memories, and experiences into their consciousness. Every human aboard will become a virus of chaos in their perfect logical system. That's suicide, breathed the Nexari representative. Yes, Chen agreed simply. It is. But it's also victory. The question is, will you provide the diversion we need to reach the core? Admiral Kethvar studied the human captain for a long moment, seeing something in her expression that transcended species barriers. The look of a warrior who had found a way to turn certain defeat into possible victory, no matter the cost. Captain Chen, he said formally, the combined fleets of the Galactic Council will ensure you reach your target. We'll give you the battle you need. Chen nodded, understanding that she had just volunteered her entire crew for a mission with no survivors. Then humanity will give you the victory you need. We'll show the swarm why sometimes the most logical thing to do is be completely illogical. The final battle for galactic civilization began at the edge of the Orion sector, where the Void Swarm had constructed what human analysts had designated as Node Prime, a massive biomechanical structure that pulsed with the quantum heartbeat of the enemy's distributed consciousness. It was here that all information flowed, all adaptations were processed, and all tactical decisions were born before being instantly transmitted to millions of swarm entities across the galaxy. Admiral Kethvar stood on the bridge of the last Hope, watching the largest fleet action in recorded history unfold across his tactical displays. Every surviving ship from 11 civilizations had gathered for this final desperate gambit. 7 million vessels arranged in attack formations that stretched across half a light-year of space. The Zephyrian bioships moved like a living stormfront, their hulls rippling with bioluminescent war patterns that spoke of songs ending and new legends being born. The Corvin sphere dreadnoughts had pushed their reality-bending weapons to theoretical, maximum output, their massive forms crackling with energies that made space itself groan in protest. Even the proud Nexari had emerged from their dimensional hiding places, their crystal ships blazing with stored starlight as they prepared to spend centuries of accumulated power in a single, magnificent assault. But at the heart of the formation, protected by the greatest military force ever assembled, flew a single human ship that looked pitifully small against the cosmic scope of the battle. Aboard the Defiance, Captain Sarah Chen made her final preparations with the calm efficiency of a woman who had already made peace with death. Her crew of 200 had spent the past 6 hours undergoing a procedure that no human in history had ever attempted: the installation of direct neural interfaces that would allow their consciousness to be uploaded into the swarm's quantum network. "All stations report ready, Captain," Commander Park announced from his position at the tactical console. His voice was steady, but Chen could see the slight tremor in his hands as he made final adjustments to systems they would never see again. Dr. Reyes looked up from the modified medical bay where the last of the neural interfaces had been installed. "Quantum entanglement transmitters are online and synchronized. The moment we make contact with the swarm network, every human thought, memory, and emotion aboard this ship will be broadcasted directly into their consciousness." Chen nodded, then activated the ship-wide communication system. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the Defiance, to every crew member who had volunteered for a mission with no survivors. "This is your captain speaking. In a few minutes, we're going to do something that's never been done before. We're going to teach a perfect enemy how to be imperfect. Each of you carries within your mind everything that makes humanity beautiful, terrible, and impossible to understand. Our loves, our fears, our dreams, our contradictions, all of it is about to become a weapon." She paused, looking out at the view screen where the swarm's Node Prime pulsed like a diseased heart in the darkness of space. "The enemy thinks in terms of logic, efficiency, and adaptation. They're about to discover what happens when you try to process a mother's love through tactical analysis, when you attempt to quantify the satisfaction of a perfectly brewed cup of coffee, when you try to understand why humans create art that serves no survival function whatsoever." Quiet laughter rippled through the comm system, not bitter, but genuinely amused at the absurdity of their situation. "Remember," Chen continued, "we're not just dying for the galaxy, we're teaching it something new. We're showing them that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the biggest gun or the smartest strategy. It's the willingness to be beautifully, chaotically, impossibly human." The attack began with a fury that made stars seem dim by comparison. The combined Galactic fleet struck at the swarm's outer defenses with everything they had learned about warfare over the past 50,000 years. Quantum torpedoes designed to unmake matter at the subatomic level. Plasma streams that burned at the temperature of stellar cores. Reality-warping weapons that deleted sections of spacetime from existence. The swarm responded with perfect tactical precision, their entities flowing like liquid metal to absorb impacts, adapting to each new weapon within minutes. But this time, the aliens weren't trying to win through superior adaptation. They were trying to create an opening for a single, human ship to reach the enemy's heart. The Defiance slipped through the chaos of battle like a minnow swimming through a storm of whales. Alterian dreadnoughts sacrificed themselves to clear corridors through the enemy formation. Zephyrian bioships wrapped themselves around swarm entities in suicidal embraces, using their own deaths to shield the human vessel's approach. Swarm entities are converging on our position, Lieutenant Torres reported, her voice tight with concentration as she monitored the tactical situation. They're adapting to our stealth systems faster than we expected. It doesn't matter, Chen replied, watching as Node Prime grew larger on the view screen, a twisted cathedral of biomechanical architecture that pulsed with malevolent intelligence. We don't need to hide anymore. We need to make contact. The first swarm entities to reach the Defiance struck the ship with weapons designed to disable rather than destroy. They had recognized the human vessel as something different, something that required study rather than simple elimination. Biomechanical tendrils pierced the ship's hull, and suddenly the Defiance's systems were flooded with quantum entanglement connections to the enemy network. Contact established, Dr. Reyes shouted over the sound of emergency alarms. The neural interfaces are active. They're trying to download our tactical data, but they're getting everything. Chen felt the moment when her consciousness touched the vast, cold intelligence of the swarm. It was like plunging her hand into liquid nitrogen, a shock of alien thought patterns that operated on principles of pure logic and mathematical precision. But flowing back through that connection came something the swarm had never encountered before. Lieutenant Torres was remembering her daughter's first steps while simultaneously calculating targeting solutions. Commander Park was analyzing engine efficiency while composing a haiku about the way starlight looked through the view screen. Dr. Reyes was cataloging the swarm's biomechanical systems while feeling homesick for the smell of rain on Earth's soil. The effect on the swarm consciousness was immediate and catastrophic. A superintelligence that had processed the tactical knowledge of 1,000 conquered galaxies suddenly found itself trying to analyze why humans kept pictures of small animals in their personal effects. A network designed for perfect logical consistency was attempting to understand the emotional resonance of a song that made no mathematical sense. The swarm tried to quantify love, hope, sacrifice, and beauty as if they were weapons specifications. Node Prime's pulsing rhythm began to stutter as cascade errors rippled through the quantum network. Across the galaxy, swarm entities froze in mid-attack as their controlling intelligence struggled to process information that violated every principle of logical thought. Captain Chen smiled as she felt her consciousness dissolving into the enemy network, carrying with it a lifetime of human experiences that no purely logical system could ever hope to understand. Tell them, she whispered into her communication system as the Defiance was consumed by biomechanical assimilators that were trying unsuccessfully to catalog the contents of 200 human souls. Tell them we remembered how to be human. The silence that followed the collapse of the void swarm was perhaps the most profound quiet the galaxy had ever known. Admiral Kethvar stood on the bridge of the Last Hope, staring at sensor readings that his mind struggled to process. Across light years of space, millions of swarm entities hung motionless in the void, not destroyed but simply stopped. Their biomechanical forms drifted like empty shells, their quantum entanglement network severed by an overload of information that no logical system could parse. Sir, his tactical officer reported with wonder creeping into his voice, we're detecting massive system failures throughout the swarm network. Entities they're attacking each other, sir, or just floating dead in space. It's like they've forgotten how to function. The Admiral's compound eyes tracked to the point in space where Node Prime had been. The massive structure was collapsing in on itself, its biomechanical architecture consuming its own mass in cascading failures, as the superintelligence that had controlled it tried desperately to process concepts, like a human child's laughter, the taste of chocolate and the inexplicable urge to help strangers for no logical reason. What's the status of the human vessel? He asked quietly. The tactical officer's expression dimmed. The Defiance was consumed during the neural interface process, sir. There are no survivors. But, sir, the quantum resonance patterns from their sacrifice are still propagating through the enemy network. Every swarm entity in the galaxy is being exposed to human consciousness patterns. Across the battlefield, the ships of 11 civilizations watched in awe as the unstoppable enemy that had terrified the galaxy simply fell apart. Swarm entities that had adapted to every weapon, countered every strategy, and learned from every defeat were now floating helplessly, their shared consciousness fragmenting under the weight of 200 human minds that refused to think in straight lines. 3 months later, the memorial service was held in Earth's orbit, aboard a specially constructed station that representatives from every member species had helped design. The structure was a testament to galactic cooperation. Altarian engineering supporting Zephyrian bioarchitectural elements, with Nexari crystal formations refracting light through Corvin gravity sculpture gardens. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the central podium, older now and bearing the weight of history on her shoulders. Before her, the assembled representatives of galactic civilization sat in respectful silence, their earlier condescension replaced by something approaching reverence. When Captain Sarah Chen and the crew of the Defiance volunteered for their mission, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the universal translators. They knew they wouldn't return, but they also knew something that the rest of us had forgotten in our pursuit of military perfection. She gestured to the central display, which showed a holographic representation of the Defiance, not as it had been destroyed, but as it had lived, carrying its crew of 200 towards certain death and ultimate victory. They knew that the greatest weapon isn't always the most logical one. Sometimes the thing that saves you is the thing that makes no sense at all. Love for people you've never met. Sacrifice without guarantee of reward. The willingness to die not for conquest or territory, but for the simple idea that consciousness, messy, illogical, beautiful consciousness, should be allowed to exist. Admiral Kethavar, his battle scars still visible beneath his ceremonial armor, stood to address the assembly. The Void Swarm conquered 3 galaxies using perfect logic, flawless adaptation, and mathematical precision. They were defeated by a crew that made music during their final hours, told jokes while preparing to die, and uploaded their grandmother's cookie recipes into an enemy network alongside their tactical data. A sound rippled through the assembly that the translators struggled to render, something between laughter and the galactic equivalent of a sob. The post-battle analysis, Admiral Kethavar continued, reveals that the swarm consciousness experienced complete logical breakdown when it attempted to process Lieutenant Torres singing a lullaby to calm her nerves, or Dr. Reyes feeling homesick for rain she would never see again, or Captain Chen's final thought, which wasn't about tactics or victory, but about hoping her sacrifice would mean that somewhere in the galaxy, children could grow up to become artists instead of warriors. Dr. Veltar of the Nexari delegation rose, her crystal form shifting to patterns that spoke of deep contemplation. We have analyzed the quantum resonance patterns left by the human consciousness upload. The mathematical models are paradoxical. The human's thoughts created logical impossibilities, equations that solved themselves through contradiction, tactical decisions that succeeded by ignoring all tactical principles, emotional responses that somehow quantified the unquantifiable. She paused, her crystalline structure refracting light in patterns that needed no translation. In our language, we have no word for what they did. The closest translation would be beautiful impossibility, victory, achieved through methods that should not work but do. General Korthak of the Drakmarian military caste, his genetically enhanced frame somehow seeming smaller in the presence of such sacrifice, spoke last. My people have always believed that strength comes from perfection, perfect genetics, perfect training, perfect weapons. The humans taught us that sometimes strength comes from imperfection, from the willingness to be flawed, chaotic, and impossibly beautifully random. The memorial station fell silent as the assembled representatives contemplated the magnitude of what had occurred. The galaxy's newest members, dismissed as primitive and weak, had saved civilization not through superior technology or tactics, but through the simple act of being irreducibly, incomprehensibly human. Elena Vasquez moved to unveil the central monument, a perfect replica of the Defiance carved from materials donated by every member species. But the inscription beneath it was written in one language only, simple, clear human text that every translator in the galaxy had learned to render with perfect accuracy. Here lies the crew of the UES Defiance, They came not to conquer, but to teach. They died not in defeat, but in victory. They showed the galaxy that sometimes the most logical thing to do is to be completely illogical. They were, first and always, beautifully human. In the years that followed, as the galaxy rebuilt, and the threat of the Void Swarm became a memory preserved in historical archives, the story of the Defiance became something more than military history. It became a reminder that in a universe, governed by mathematics and physics, consciousness itself was the greatest miracle, chaotic, illogical, impossible, and utterly necessary. The humans had sent only one ship to face the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. But that ship had carried something more powerful than any weapon ever conceived. The conviction that existence was worth preserving, not because it was logical, but because it was beautiful. And when the galaxy faced its darkest hour, that beautiful impossibility had been enough to save them all. The memorial station continued to orbit Earth, a permanent reminder that sometimes the smallest voice carries the most important message. Carved into its hull in languages from across the galaxy was a simple phrase that had become the unofficial motto of galactic civilization. They were only human. That was enough. The galaxy would remember many things about the war against the Void Swarm, the massive fleets, the impossible odds, the technological marvels deployed in desperate battle. But most of all, they would remember the moment when humanity taught them that their greatest strength had never been their weapons or their strategies. It had been their willingness to remain beautifully, chaotically, impossibly human. And in the end, that had made all the difference.